it's my pleasure to hand over to Christophe Besse, Minister, Councillor, Head of Trade and Economy Section at the Delegation of the European Union here in Korea. Christophe, the floor is yours.
Oui, bonjour, bonjour à tous. Je vais commencer donc avec quelques mots en français et puis après je vais passer vers l'anglais pour la suite de ma présentation. Donc, effectivement, je suis ministre conseiller à la délégation de l'Union européenne. La délégation de l'Union européenne ici à Séoul, c'est une espèce d'ambassade. Nous sommes diplomates. Vous avez entendu tout à l'heure mon ambassadrice qui a fait donc une introduction. Notre rôle, c'est essentiellement un rôle de représentation des intérêts de l'Union européenne dans les domaines de compétences de l'Union européenne, et aussi un rôle de reporting, évidemment. Alors, après, je vais vous parler du commerce et de l'investissement, et c'est une compétence exclusive de l'Union européenne. Donc, c'est pour ça que nous sommes là. Et moi, je suis un petit peu, si vous voulez, le chien de garde de l'accord de libre-échange entre l'Union européenne et la Corée. So I shift to English now. So basically, why do we do trade? Well, because there is industrial specialization and comparative advantages. That's economic theories. And by this, we create economic wealth and jobs. That's as simple as that. And it works, actually. We have calculated that for every 1 billion euro of EU exports that the EU exports to third countries, this supports 13,000 jobs in the EU. So 13,000 jobs in the EU are created with just 1 billion euros of exports. And of course, our FTA between the EU and Korea has been in place for the last 10 years. And therefore, our trade, bilateral trade, thanks to this FTA, has been growing twice as fast as the EU trade with any other country without an FTA. So you see there is a clear benefit from having an FTA. Before the FTA, Korea's tariffs averaged 8%. And 10 years later, so now today, they are close to 0%. So that's very interesting. Just a concrete example, for a car, the exportation of a car, you can consider that the FTA has saved around 2,000 euros in customs duties, in taxes, import taxes, if you want, per exported vehicle. So you see it's quite substantial on the export of a car. So here you see the picture of the exchanges between the EU on the left side and Korea on the right side. So we are talking, of course, of two different economic areas with quite different sizes in terms of GDP, in terms of population. The EU and Korea bilateral trade reached around 110 billion euros in 2021, which represents an increase of 71% since the entry into force of the FTA. Trade is balanced, I would say, between the EU and Korea, although Korea feels very often that it is running a deficit. Well, I would say overall it's balanced. So Korea is the 9th largest destination for EU merchandise exports, while the EU is Korea's 3rd largest export market. And our trade is highly concentrated in a number of commodities. So first, machinery, transport equipment, and chemicals. This is really the bulk. If you put together these three categories, it reaches almost 2/3 of the exports. between the two sides. So the next two slides are about the tariff elimination for exports on both sides. So the first slide, this one, is about the tariff elimination for EU exports. So you see, since the entry into force of the FTA, the duties have diminished quite substantially, and you see there are schedules. It works like this in FTAs. There are schedules for the implementation of the tariff dismantling, and as you can see, after 10 years, we are almost at zero. So, for instance, to give you an idea of the achievements, in 10 years, the EU wine exports have tripled. The EU olive oil exports have more than doubled, and the cheese exports have been multiplied by 6. I'm talking, of course, of foodstuff, because this is something that is maybe not the most, the largest amount in terms of export value, but it's always very telling and something very concrete when we talk of food and foodstuff. Another example, the export of Mercedes-Benz cars, they have increased in 10 years, thanks to the FTA, from around 16,000 cars to 75,000 cars in the last year to Korea. So you see a huge increase. So this slide is about tariff elimination for Korean exports. So we see a little bit the same pattern. So you see a decrease of the tariffs since the entry into force of the FTA. So the EU eliminated all its tariffs on industrial products within 5 years of the entry into force of the FTA. And therefore, there are no more tariffs on industrial products on both sides. So beyond tariff dismantling, there are also other disciplines in the FTA. There is a services chapter, there is a public procurement chapter, IPR, this is intellectual property rights. There are also competition rules, and also there is a chapter about sustainable development. So for public procurement, for instance, the EU firms can tender for public work concessions in Korea. For intellectual property rights, we have, for instance, a protection of EU geographical indications. So, for instance, we will enlarge this to 43 new GIs. For example, Irish cream, Kalamata olive oil, or Pecorino Toscano will soon be protected in Korea. For TSD, trade and sustainable development, we have Korea's ratification of 3 ILO conventions out of 4. And we have also the implementation of international environment agreements like the Paris Agreement. So the non-tariff barriers, there are essentially, I would say, 2 sectors, industrial sectors, that are covered by strong discipline. So there is the electronics sector, and there is the automotive sector. And the purpose is essentially in these sectors to ensure that the European goods don't have to replicate a number of testing and certification procedures when they are exported to Korea. And of course, this goes in both directions. But I would say this is probably one of the sectors, the issue of the technical barriers to trade, where we are struggling most. It's relatively easy to do tariff dismantling. It's much more difficult to ensure disciplines when it comes to technical barriers and regulations. So what is missing in our FTA? First, we are missing an investment chapter, and we are missing also a digital trade chapter. Among the trade irritants that we have in the FTA, we still have the direct shipment clause. So in other words, it is not possible in order to benefit for the FTA, you have to ship directly the goods from the EU to Korea or vice versa. You cannot use, for instance, hubs like many enterprises do in Singapore in order to do repackaging and so on, and then re-export from Singapore, for instance, to Korea. So this is a main impediment. We have also a number of SPS, that sanitary and phytosanitary issues. And we have, as I said before, TBTs, so technical barriers to trade. So the next slide is to invite the young entrepreneurs amongst you to take advantage of the FTA. So the FTA, the preference utilization rate under the FTA has greatly increased from 40% 10 years ago to around 74% recently. So it means more and more exporters are using the FTA rather than any other preference like most favored nations, for instance. We have a website that is called Access to Market that is very, very useful. You will find all kinds of information there for product by product exportation, information, tariffs and taxes, customs procedures, rules of origin, trade barriers, statistics. So it's really useful, and it's free of charge. I really invite you to look at this website. We have also a number of working groups under the FTAs. We have something like 23 working groups and committees that meet annually between us, so the EU and Korea, in order to discuss the trade irritants and how to improve. I was mentioning, for instance, the agreement on geographical indications and the addition of a number of GIs. So this was discussed, of course, during these committees and working groups. We have monthly meetings of trade councillors. We have the chambers. You have representatives of the chambers in these video calls and export promotion agencies. So there is really a wide network of professionals that are here to help you to take advantage of the FTA. So how does this legal framework, I presented very briefly and very rapidly the framework for our trade and investment relations. How does this materialize in terms of data, in terms of figures? Well, first, as I said, we have 110 billion euros of bilateral trade of goods. This is quite substantial. Yeah, sometimes there is a small surplus for the EU, sometimes there is a small surplus for Korea. Personally, I think this is irrelevant. I would say overall we are on balance, and we should not pay too much attention to that. So if we now look at the breakdown of the EU-Korea bilateral trade by member states. So as you know, inside the EU, we have 27 member states. And if you look at this chart, it's quite telling that there is one trade superpower, which is Germany. And roughly speaking, Germany accounts for 1/3 of EU trade with Korea. And it's mostly focused on cars, machinery, chemicals. But France is also a big exporter. You can think of Airbus, for instance, Airbus aircraft. So there were not many deliveries in the last 2 years, but this is also a big export item. Italy is also very important with machinery. Netherlands, maybe you have heard about ASML. major exporter of machinery for semiconductors manufacturing. To be noted that for the Netherlands and Belgium, figures are probably inflated by what we call the Rotterdam and the Antwerpen effect. So just a few words about services. So we have a trade of services between the EU and Korea that amounts to about 20 billion euros annually. So much less than trade of goods, of course, but still very sizable. So of course the main sectors in the services, it's transportation. But you have also royalties and license fees, travel, of course, tourism was badly impacted over the last 2 years because of the COVID crisis. And I remind you that the Incheon airport is still operating only about 10% of what it used to do in the pre-COVID times. And finally, this is my last slide. I would like to give you just a short snapshot of the FDI. So that's the investment, foreign direct investment. So it is not always very well known, but the EU is the largest investor in Korea. It is not China. China is the #1 trade partner of Korea, but not when it comes to investment. It is not the US, it is not Japan, it is Europe. The EU has about 32% of the total FDI stock in Korea. And while Japan, for instance, which comes second, has only 23%. So for me, this is really a sign of our long-term trust in the Korean economy. If we invest in Korea, this is because we trust this economy. We trust the opportunities brought by Korea. Now, if we look by member states, Netherlands is the largest investor in Korea, about 40% of our stock of FDI, followed by Germany and France. But I would caution against this figure because this is probably very much inflated by the fact that there is a special tax regime, a corporate tax regime, very favorable in the Netherlands. And therefore, you have a number of companies that are not necessarily originating in the Netherlands that are actually registered as companies in the Netherlands. So it's to some extent, I would say, for tax reasons. Yes, and finally, I would like to mention that also in the other direction, there has been a recent rise of Korean investment flows into the EU. And it's mainly to Netherlands and to Germany. So also a lot of Korean investors now investing into the EU. It's quite noticeable in the last 2 years. So I will finish with this. I think I managed more or less to stay on time and to hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much for your attention and have a good day.